Today, we are making a conclusion, a conversation on the resource history of Russia. Everything that we have discussed or discussed here, as Gorbachev would say, is in our playlist, which will be a link to which will be given under this video. Innovative resource of Russia of the future theme. Recall that we discussed with you 6 stages of 216 years according to Pavel Sviridov, Kievan Rus. Fragmented Rus, Horde Rus, Muscovite Tsardom, the Russian Empire, and the new Russia, which we live in right now, which began in 1917th year. Each of these Russias is very separately Russia, a kind of Russia. But we were only interested in the export product, which we extracted for export for the authorities. The people that is mined. Here. And this product was changing. It has been changing throughout the millennium, and it has been changing, so to speak, ascending. At first it was skull slaves, then skin cattle, then bread, then furs. In the Moscow Kingdom, in the Russian Empire, there was mainly hemp, flax, bread. But now we have mainly hydrocarbon deposits. In other words, the export product is changing. But, so to speak, it is climbing the ladder, because it is becoming more and more difficult to extract each export product, and more difficult. You see, right? The fact is that our export industry has been developing in an upward direction, right? But the people live there. Yes, and what have we come to? We have come to the conclusion that the forecast shows that the next 7th period, which will begin in 108 years, in 109 years, to be more precise, yes. This is a predictable stage, it will be a creative stage, when the main resource will not be the subsoil, not flax, neither furs, nor animals, not bread, but there will be a creative resource with the people. That's when it will become the main thing for our country and will dominate, and our country will transform like a phoenix bird and turn into a completely different country. Here. But then, returning to our topic here. Today the topic is like this. We need to show that in 1913th year, there was a serious fracture of the entire history of export Russia, and the way out of this fracture must also be shown why. Because so far no one understands what happened in 1913th year. The resource curse of Russia. Let's start with the 20th century. Here you see the curves here. What is it? This is an export. Here are the exports in some conventional units, including percentages, yes. Look, what did we have in the 1960s, 1970s? The red curve. We look at what kind of car, equipment, and vehicles it is. In other words, in the 60s and 70s of the last century, we had the export of our cars in the leading position. Oddly enough, yes. But they were sold, of course, to third world countries, but it doesn't matter that it was still in the first place. Therefore, it required engineers, higher education, and other things. In order to export products to other countries, it is necessary to make them very well, and therefore, good engineers, specialists, and so on are needed. But the export of our, so to speak, fuel resources, electricity, was in third place. But in the 1970s, unexpectedly for the entire population, but probably expected for our government, because it was Andropov's program, in my opinion, our export fuel resource energy suddenly skyrocketed and began to dominate. You see, look, in the 70s, the energy sector grew to 50% in the sector, even to more than 50%. That's what it led to. This led to the fact that, look, the whole 20th century, well, after the revolution, there was no export at all. Here. Then we tried, our country tried to bet on grain in the 30s, it failed. After the war on industrial products, what I was talking about. But since the 70s, these are hydrocarbons, and the volume of hydrocarbon exports in monetary terms is much greater than the industrial products. We sold their tractors of Belarus and so on abroad, and agricultural products. That is why we began to be perceived as a gas station. Here is the famous, so to speak, McCain, who spoke very sharply about our address to Russia. It's a gas station, trying to pass itself off as a country. This is the position of the entire American establishment. That is, what we are showing off their supplies, so to speak, just resources, yes. What about these world achievements of the USSR? How about these weapons? Well, armaments are being said now, of course, that is, they play some role, but not in that industry. The decline began in the 1970s. That's exactly when we started exporting oil and gas. That's when it began to decline. The number of scientific discoveries is a very good indicator. This grew until the 60s. Until the 80s, it reached its peak. We were almost leaders in the world, and then it went to nothing. Coincides, subsides, and by the end of the 80s, almost the number of scientific discoveries had slipped to nothing. The number of researchers is the same. Look, in the 90s after the collapse of the USSR, it seems so to speak. There were quite a lot of them, here in the thousands. And then in the 90s, now it's all fallen by 2 6/10 of a fold. But this is a landslide. This is a real landslide. Such an indicator, as the production of metal-cutting machines, is also a very characteristic indicator. In general, metal-cutting machines are needed for industry. If there are fewer of them, then the industry, accordingly, falls. It has fallen 17 6/10 of the time since the 90s. Look what a disaster, right? It's the same with bearings, but without bearings, you can't do anything at all. They won't do anything there, yes. At 18 1/10. In other words, this is the collapse of the entire industry. And this collapse has affected our well-being as well. This curve here is the GDP per person of the former USSR to the global average GDP per person from the beginning of our era to the 2003 year. Well, let's not look at the beginning of our era there. Let's look at the very top lines. These are the 60s and 70s. As you can see, we have an excess of the world average GDP by 50%. See, 150%, right? That's where the maximum falls in the 70s. In other words, we were 1.5 times ahead of the average human resource in the world. But in the 90s, despite the fact that after the 90s we live better than before, but relative to other countries, the same China, we live much worse, 1.5 times worse. We have 70%. In other words, our GDP per capita has almost doubled in relation to the global one. Well, again, a monopoly resource. We have said many times that Russia is a unique country, but there are several such countries, including Venezuela, let's say Iraq, and several other countries in which one type of export product is dominant. It is always more than 50%. It has always been in the whole history, yes. In the 13th year, food and agricultural raw materials were dominant, 54 to 7/10%. See, it's blue, right? In the 19th year, we see that these are mineral resources, and there are 63%. In other words, this trend has now resumed, and it has recovered. But in these two graphs, in these two curves, there is a picture, yes, there is an amazing mystery. An amazing mystery that we are going to consider now. Why? Because the production of agricultural raw materials in such a large amount, it required a lot of effort from the entire population of the country. But the production of mineral resources requires a population of only 500,000 people, 500,000. This is a very big difference, and we will see what it has led to now. So, we see that since Kievan Rus, we have 10 export products mainly, well, maybe less, and there are always dominants among them. Nothing has changed for 1,000 years. This is a sector, so to speak, image here, that these are the products of the fuel of the energy complex. You see, right? Well, there are still timber, fertilizers, metals, machinery and equipment, just a little bit. There may be a little bit somewhere. So, what do we see? There was a short period in the history of Russia, which is only 2% of the entire time of the history of Russia. Here it is shown 20-30 years in 12 centuries, 2%, this is in the 60s and 70s. That's when we were exporting high-tech equipment. The rest of the time, 98% of our history, we supplied gifts of nature and agricultural products. This is what happened in the 20th century, after the 70s. Here we see, we rose by hunting and gathering, cattle breeding, agriculture. It's all a rise. Then agriculture collapsed in the Moscow Kingdom. Well, there were objective conditions there. Why? Because there was, as you remember, the Little Ice Age. The conditions for agriculture deteriorated sharply. The population fled to the south partially, and Siberia began to develop partially. And now the development of Siberia has brought us back to the starting point. Hunting and gathering, yes, is a much lower level of activity than farming, cattle breeding, and so on. Here we are. The collapse happened. Then, starting with Peter the Great, the rise of manufactories and industry, there began again. After the revolution, we jumped into space, entry. But in the 70s, we again fell into collecting, fell to the lowest level of life. In other words, our country is dominated by gathering. Only now we are not collecting mushrooms, berries, here we are not shooting, so to speak, an animal, we are collecting the bowels. That's the same thing, that is, well, it's a little more complicated. We need to spend pipes there in order to export it all. Make installations, but it's still collecting, we don't produce anything. Well, we do, but not so much that it was noticeable. Now that's what we're going to talk about. Millions of Russians, who have been extracting natural resources to the elite for millennia, are unnecessary to the raw materials economy. That's what immediately affected. Look, after we started exporting in the 70s, the country's population was still growing by inertia. But when the USSR collapsed, the curve began to decline sharply. Regarding the forecast, we lost 21 million people, almost like in the Second World War. Imagine, after the destruction of the Soviet Union. But for the sake of objectivity, I must say that in fact, we lost 12 million. Here they are. But theoretically, we have lost a lot. Is that why? Because I repeat once again, it means that our industry, which peaked during space flights, collapsed. And the people continued to live, and now live mainly by subsistence farming. What we have now is not our products, not our industry. We are surrounded by gadgets from China, cars from Germany, and imported equipment. Basically, we consume it all at the expense of our natural resources, oil and gas. So what happened? What happened was that by the end of the period of this 13th year, the country was peasant. She continued to be a peasant for 1,000 years. 90% of the population was peasants. Well, there are some nobles, there's another one, the Cossacks by something, but mostly the peasant population. Now we are approaching 1913th year. This is the year. Regarding him, by the way, in the Soviet Union, a lot of things were compared there, were done there. What happened in the 13th year, we considered when we watched the history of Tsarist Russia. You see, this is the import and export curve. Export is export, import is import. You can see that until 1913th year, exports, that is, the export of products, we had higher than who imports. In the 13th year, for objective reasons, which we considered at the relevant meetings, sharply decreased. Mainly grain exports decreased. See, he went down. But imports went up. And the gap fell just in the 17th year. What does this gap mean? This means that we sold very little, the revenue was small, and we bought a lot. And at the expense of what we bought a lot, due to loans, debts, that is, the Russian Empire got into debt. Why? Is this the minus zone? The blue one is a plus zone, and the red one is a minus zone. In other words, we had a positive balance, and after the 13th year, it became negative. In other words, Russia spent more than it produced on the foreign market. due to what it turned out. This happened due to the fact that the efficiency of agriculture fell sharply. There are several reasons there, but we will not consider them now. We state the fact. We stopped being exporters, we became importers. But in order to import something, you need to take money from somewhere, and we got into debt to France, England, the USA, and so on, Germany, in my opinion. Well, hardly in Germany. So these debts, they brought down our empire, the Russian Empire. In the end, by the 17th year, it became clear that these debts could not be repaid. The Bolsheviks refused to pay these debts, for which, in principle, so to speak, they decided to punish us. The Entente went to war with us, but somehow it didn't work out for them. But the 13th year is, among other things, also a very characteristic moment in the history of Russia. Why? Because if you look further, you see that here the export-import was basically about the same. That is, there was no such plus balance. Then plus or minus. Here. The Russian state itself happened. For Russia, for the first time in its history, there was no traditional exit, switching to new export natural resources, or expanding space. There was nowhere to expand. There was no other natural resource. The only grain export that was profitable, and very profitable, before the revolution, until the 13th year. He led the country to incessant hunger strikes, starvation, and eventually the depletion of land, and the decline of export opportunities. Yes, there have been no problems of this scale in the entire history of Russia. In other words, in the 13th year, our country for the first time faced a problem when there was nothing to export, and the people could no longer produce anything on the foreign market. It was the exhaustion of export potential that led the entire state machine of the Russian Empire to collapse, and the excess millions of landless peasants to a popular revolt. That is why the revolution began and the civil war followed. And look what happened after the revolution, the Civil War. Grain, pay attention. This is the export of grain goods of millions of tons. Look here, exports exceed imports by several times in the 6th year, in the 13th year. But here, well, after the revolution, by some miracle, we managed to export grain for some time in the 30s. And then all of this fell. Since the 65th year of Khrushchev's times, when you remember we started sowing corn, right? We import grain goods, that is, the import of grain has almost become dominant. In the 75th year, it became noticeable at all, and in the 85th year, it was incredibly noticeable. In other words, our agriculture has become unprofitable since the 60s. It could not feed the country, and therefore we had to buy grain, buy food. At the expense of what? At the expense of oil and gas. The situation began to change a little in the 2001 year after Putin came to power. Well, Putin, so to speak. In the 7th or 13th year. Now our grain exports have grown, and we feed the whole world, and we can feed ourselves. But this picture of the proportions, it has not changed. Look, the 19th year, once again, the mineral resource is 63%. And where are the agricultural products here? Food and agricultural products, 5 and 9/10%. 6% of all exports are our puffed-up cheeks about the fact that we export grain abroad. That's 6%. Something will change in our life if 6% of exports disappear. That is, we stop exporting grain. Budget revenue will fall by 6%, by 6%. Yes, this is for Russia, it's about nothing at all. But if we stop selling mineral resources and goods, our exports will drop by 63%. It will be the collapse of the entire state machine, because it is supported by these visions. So, what happened after the 13th year? Here we are. Exports switched from grain to oil and gas. What has changed? What has changed is that only 500,000 people can extract a new resource in Russia. In other words, about 500,000 people are currently employed in this fuel sector. Can you imagine? The question is, why should the resource economy, mind you, the resource economy, not you and me who love our country, but the resource economy of the other 140 million people? And what has changed? The authorities of old Russia needed the people as the extraction of transport goods. Beekeepers, farmers in the fields, hemp producers, fur hunters, loggers, and so on were needed. And that's why the population of Russia has been growing since Peter the Great. Well, it used to grow there until 1900th year. It grew, and reached 147, in my opinion. Millions by the revolution, right. What has changed since we switched to hydrocarbons? And here's what's changed. For the first time in the long history of the country, the population began not to grow, but to fall. And fall at a catastrophic rate. What is 21 million losses in just 30 years? This has never happened in our history. Why? Because our export economy does not need people, so the population is shrinking. No matter what they say on TV, the facts show that the population is declining. We don't need people. In fact. But with all the verbiage of the authorities, he is not needed. But I must say that this situation is not only typical for us, but also for other countries of the world. Because, in other words, there are global processes, which I will not talk about now, which lead to a reduction in the able-bodied population of Japan since the 90s, you see. The able-bodied population has also declined. The German population began to decline, but the truth is a little later than 2005 year. In other words, in the developed countries of the world, the population no longer needs it. Well, this is a common theme of population reduction, the Schwab program, and so on. We're not going to touch it now. We will only talk about our country. What do we have now? Here we have, so to speak, a diagram that shows that 70 million people work in thousands. 74 do not work officially in our country. In other words, this is the picture. Deprivation of the world elite. Accordingly, it is necessary to leave 15-30 million inhabitants in Russia. This was voiced by Margaret Thatcher. Then, however, they tried to disavow this speech. But if they are going to reduce the entire world population to 500 million, then what about Russia? Will Russia be pathetic? No, of course not. Here are the historical analogies. Siberia as a reserve for respite for the next step up. Stairs to the cosmosphere, civilization. Look, in difficult moments, when we have an economic crisis, we slide into collecting. It was in the Moscow Kingdom, and it happened after the 74th year. 1 in 1. That is, we can't do anything. We will rip off Mother Nature. Get ready to do it. So to speak, during the transition of the Muscovite kingdom, Nikola Selyanovich, hero number 3 of Horde Russia, stands in place of Ermak, hero of Russia number 4, begins to explore Siberia. So, the Little Ice Age, yes, for agriculture in Russia. It's about the same story, but for different reasons. Now we have completely different reasons, but then there were other reasons, but they led to the same result. Many villages simply died out of hunger. In the period between 1500 and 1550s, the population of the northwestern Russian lands decreased by about 15%. That is, in the transition from some technological way to gathering, hunting, it is not important to collect mineral resources there. The population is shrinking. Why? Because I want to tell you that it is possible to approach this issue very sensitively, as people. Well, what is our population? It should increase constantly. It's shrinking. Well, how so? It's very simple. The fact is that there are economic laws that absolutely don't care about all our emotions, feelings, our entire, so to speak, attitudes to our culture and so on. If fewer people are needed to survive, then the population will shrink. It's the economy, it's tough. But if the demand for its products falls at the enterprise, then what does it do to the management of this enterprise? Shortens it. It fires workers from the enterprise. Our country is also a gigantic, more complex enterprise. And that is why our government, It reduces the population because it does not need so much population in order to extract our resources to preserve. It needs somewhere out there, at best, 50 million. The remaining 100 million, there are not needed from the point of view of power, resource power, you know. So what to do in this situation of the traditional future of Russia? Now we will move from this gloomy, so to speak, analysis of the situation to an optimistic forecast of the future. It's difficult, but we will try to do it. Toffler once proposed such a scheme, but it is simple, even an appropriating economy, an agrarian traditional society, an industrial society, an information society is very obvious. These are the stages of human development from ancient times to the future. Yes, I decided that this is not quite the right scheme. Why? Because before the industrial society, everything seems to be right, but from my point of view, this is a little different from what the information society is. Therefore, I suggested, so the next step will be the era of industrial society. This is ethereal informatics and ethereal technologies. What it is a separate topic of a big conversation. I'm not going to touch on all of this now. Here is another aspect that has absolutely nothing to do with our topic. This is the relay race of civilization. But we still need to say something about it. The fact is that humanity developed separate local civilizations. They are so-called local civilizations. They appear, take the next step, and disappear. That's where the Egyptian civilization is. Where are the pharaohs? Where are their gods? There are practically no more of them left on the surface of the earth. Only their monuments remain. For 2,000 years, Egypt pulled humanity forward with a locomotive, then Mesopotamia pulled for 2,000 years, then antiquity. China, the Indo-Arabs pulled. Recently, humanity has been pulling the European locomotive forward, but by the 2000th year, it had exhausted its creative potential. Then they enter the imperial phase, which I have told many times. The next civilization that will replace the European civilization is the Russian civilization. Thank God, our president finally uttered these key words, calling us a state civilization recently. Here I have been drowning for this topic for a very long time. I will write books on this topic. We are not a country, we are a civilization, and we have a law of civilizational development, absolutely civilizational. And what kind of law is this? Any civilization, starting from ancient Egypt and ending with our civilization, goes through 4 stages of development. The first 500 years are the preparation of a unified information platform for land development. The development of the world heritage is the second 500 years. This is education. These are world universities. But 1,000 years after the start of a local civilization, the most important period begins, for the sake of which this civilization, strictly speaking, appears on the surface. The creation of one's own worldview and a new paradigm begins. We are now at this point from transitioning from apprenticeship to creation. Well, to give the spread of canonization. Here Europe is, the West is at this point. They are 500 years older than us, but older does not mean better. A young man is better than an old man. Here, according to my calculations, the civilization of Russia comes from apprenticeship. We can't learn any further. We need to create our own worldview and teach everyone else later. That's where we're actually going to take humanity. Humanity, in principle, will take only 3 steps. These are the ecosphere gathering, hunting, agricultural spheres, cattle farming, and the technosphere of industry. The next stage of development is the cosmosphere. I have told you about it many times. We will not go into it now, but only the next local civilization can be taken to the next step. This is us, Russia. Starting from this moment, with this report, we will do it. Russia in the 21st century has reached its trajectory in the creative rendezvous of cosmospherization, of the planetary and space future. That's what it's all set out in these books. And the last cherry on the cake, the detailing is already underway. Will there be a third innovation wave in Russia? In other words, you remember that I accidentally completely discovered that we have 2 waves of 75 years, clearly 75 years. The first industrial wave began in 1845 year, At its peak, it gave our industry. This one, which is known as the Tsarist industry, pre-revolutionary industry, gave people like Mendeleev, Pavlov, Tsiolkovsky, and a whole galaxy of other scientists, engineers, inventors, and Sikorsky including, and Tupolev and Korolev. All of this was the product of this first industrial wave. But one way or another, there is every wave of innovation in Russia. It lasts 75 years. We reach our power at the peak. And then it quickly slides down, and by the 21st year, we have practically nothing left of this industry. Everything was destroyed. And it was necessary to rebuild the industry. And so Stalin's industrialization led to the fact that in the 65th, 75th year, we were at the peak in all indicators, according to scientific, technical, technological, export, and so on. Other heroes appeared here, and like Korolev, Keldysh, Kurkatev, Gagarin, well, thousands of portraits can be brought to the glorious period of this second industrial wave. If these waves are coming and rolling, so to speak, periodically, then, well, here we have the most one thing in the 96th year by all indicators, that is, we are on the rise of the third wave. Here we are in the 25th year, and so far, we do not see this wave clearly, although it is already manifested thanks to its rise. But we will clearly notice this wave in the 45th or 55th year, when it reaches its peak. And what kind of heroes there will be, what kind of queens Keldysh and Gagarin will be here, we'll see. There's not much left, about 20 years. But the nature of this wave will be completely different. If the previous wave was completely Soviet, if the first wave was mainly Western equipment there, then the nature of the third wave, which I predict will peak in the 45th year approximately, will be the following. There are 5 main levels here. Agriculture, of course, is ours. Local industry is naturally domestic. But we will buy mass-demand goods and equipment in China or India or anywhere, but we will not mainly produce ourselves. Why? Because it's not our business. The Lord's business is to make slippers and galoshes. Putin correctly said at the time, galoshes are not our business. But unique products based on innovative developments are our business. Therefore, it will be like this structure. And the main thing is that it will be based on new technologies. The generation of innovative layers of Russia begins to develop. There are all prerequisites for this, believe me. Every 10th Russian, this statistical study, I believe the quote, is the author of technological innovations used in everyday life. This conclusion was reached by Konstantin Forumas and Thomas Turna in the framework of research conducted for the Higher School of Economics. In Britain, 6%, Finland 5%, in the USA 5%, Japan 3%, in the Arab world 0%. I mean, look, yes. In other words, we are leaders in creative innovation potential. It must definitely be activated. Here are the favorites in my articles and books. Thank you. So, good afternoon, dear viewers, dear participants. Today we have the 9th meeting. It is devoted to a very interesting detailed analysis of the structure of the stages of Russia. We have devoted the previous 8 meetings to the fact that we have considered the resource history of Russia. And we have allocated a 216-year cycle. This is an astrological cycle which, generally speaking, in the works of Pavel Sviridov, Andrey Kinsbursky suggested to me here. It actually really exists, and in previous broadcasts we have shown that, so to speak, there were cycles that Kievan Rus, Fragmented Rus, Horde Rus, the Moscow Kingdom, the Russian state. All of them clearly fit into this 216-year period with one degree or another, so to speak, exactly. Each period was characterized by its own dominant, its own, so to speak, dominant export. If the first one was this jaw of slaves that were supplied, then it means that there was a dominant one. It was the skin and meat that was crushed there in the Moscow Kingdom, then. Bread came out in the first place in the Horde Kingdom, oddly enough. In the Moscow Kingdom, fur is in the first place, and therefore, so to speak, there were trips to Siberia. The expansion of the territory in order to export more fur. The Russian Empire was characterized, so to speak, by hemp in the first place, from which ropes were made, sails were made, flax. Then it all ended when the submarine fleet, in principle, did not become useless to anyone. Here the Russian Empire resettled for the export of bread. Here it was all very, very, very rude. I would say too much, so to speak, in the most general terms, that is. We did not consider any details inside these 216-year cycle. In fact, The whole historical process clearly fits into astrological cycles, in which there are 360-year cycles, 216-year cycles, 108-year cycles, 72-year cycles, 36-year cycles, and 12-year cycles. It was all very well described by Pavel Sviridov, proved. This is Andrey Kinsbursky, who pushed me in this direction, also considered me very well in his articles and works. And now we have almost finished reviewing the resource history of our country. Why? Because the resource history of our country, as you remember at the previous meeting, ended in 1913th year, before the outbreak of the First War, when the export of bread went down sharply, because there were too many people, and it was impossible to feed their population, let alone export bread there. Cataclysms began. Russia began to shake on potholes, and after 1917th year, it moved into the stage, as we have repeatedly said, of the median development of its culture, pushed off from the West, and, strictly speaking, tried to develop during the Soviet era as an independent civilization. This has happened many times. This is the third such visit in an independent period. But this period from 1917th year to 2025th year, which is a very important point, and we will explain why 2025th year, coming in 2 years so to speak, is the key year. It is generally impossible to consider it in the same way as we considered the previous stages, because if it was enough for us to look at the history of Russia from the point of view of resource cycles, as the history of the change of 216-year stages, then from 1917th year, such a view will be too general and of little significance. Therefore, we decided that Andrey would devote us to these details of these cycles, namely, that within a 216-year cycle, there are 72-year stages, within a 72-year cycle, there are two 36-year stages, of which it consists, and within a casual 36-year period, there are 12-year periods, and each of these periods has a very important semantic load. That is, not just periods. Each period is characterized by its own systemic patterns. That is, let's say, if the first 12-year period is formation, the second is development, the third is retention. Then we get such a rise and fall of each period, and each period has a certain historical value for our country. Here, but I have explained to you at length why we are moving from a 216-year history to a more detailed structuring. Now I think Andrey will tell us what he sees in this structure, and then we will discuss with you, and try to apply this astrological typology, so to speak, in order to predict what awaits us after the key changes in the 25th year. Andrey Vladimirovich Kinsbursky, a professional artist, philosopher, esotericist, astrologer, here, writer, here, well, he was also illustrated, among other things, almost all of my reports, books. Here is my friend Andrey Vladimirovich. I give you the floor. Start. First of all, good afternoon to everyone. Our lecture is devoted to the last, let's say, period of Russia's development, which to some extent is familiar to us, because these are events related to the era of the USSR and the last most well-known years of the Tsarist Empire. Well, in more detail here you can see the questions. These questions in my article The Creative Cycle of Russia are published on the website of the Academy of Trinitarianism. What interests us first of all? We are interested in what awaits us in the future. And in the near future, we have 2025th year looming before us, so to speak. This is a year where a lot of important influences converge, and this year, in theory, should be very important for the development, for changing, so to speak, the state of our country. Here, for example, there is even such a well-known Simpson program, which for some reason claims that at the end of the 24th of next year, in September, the USSR 2.0 will be declared, that is, here it is. So our representative will turn over the card, and not only will all the former republics be joined to us later, but even Scandinavia and Finland. Well, it's like forecasts. And here we see a picture of these cycles. Here we have 108-year cycles converge at this point. Out of 144-year cycles converge, but this green one highlights our epoch, which began in the 2018th year and which will end somewhere in the 2133rd year. And we are, in theory, approaching the very middle of this era. And this is a very important point in all cycles. Why? Because it is connected with the point of change of movement. If before that, as it were, We see this arc ascending until this year. Then it seems to descend on the axis. And this cycle ends, as it were, and a new cycle begins. What is a cycle, and in general, how is it all? Why do they arise, and so on? It means that everything that we distinguish in the surrounding world, as certain entities, objects, things, we call them by some names, or common names, if these are some similar phenomena to each other, or this is a proper name. And what do we distinguish these phenomena, separate them from each other? Because we imagine each such phenomenon as a kind of whole, separated, consisting of parts. And depending on what parts there are, what these parts are made up of, how they are stacked together, it means that this kind of depends on this feature of the systemic structure of all phenomena. But at the same time, they have something in common in all systemic phenomena. Well, let's analyze how we do it. So the idea of these systemic mathematical structures. It was also stated at one time by Archimedes in the theory of music of the celestial spheres. It exists. It is well known to all our musicians. These are harmonious consonances and disharmonious dissonances. If anyone wants, they can dive into the os of all these, so to speak, theories, and study it in more detail. As what consonance exists, what dissonances. The same thing is reflected in astrology, only under different terms. These are already called aspects, not consonance dissonances, and non-harmonic dissonances are called tense aspects. And harmonious consonances are called harmonious aspects. Aspects are these arcs, which depict some, so to speak, energy. It was also described here in the book Als, Avane, and Arrhenius, and was spoken from the solar system, where all the movements of celestial bodies associated with some such harmonics are calculated on a mathematical level. It is possible to depict all phenomena conditionally on a plane in the form of others, as we see. In the form of a certain circle or circle, well, and the most complex form is, let's say, a spiral. Therefore, it is not for nothing that in the Russian language any development of any phenomenon is called development. That is, certain turns that go in a certain direction can expand, narrow, change, but there is a certain similarity in each turn. And here we see here, if we divide the whole into three parts, then it is conditionally possible to depict all these phenomena in this way. A kind of general scheme. That is, the first part here, the second part, the third part. The first part is a part of the ascent. The second part is connected with the center, with the middle of the cycle. It is an attempt to keep, so to speak, the state that has been achieved. But, as a result of the fact that there is a point of opposition here at the very top, there is still a rethinking. Finding some problems in this, the third stage takes place in the system organization. This is the descent stage. Here it's all conventionally depicted. Is that clear? Yes, Andrey. Do you understand? Yes, it means that you can still read it all like that again. The first turn is a turn of a statement or thesis from the starting point. The second turn is a turn. And the second part of this cycle is the opposite or antithesis in the middle of the turn and the reversals of movement. And the third is the construction, the final construction, that is, the combination of this statement and the opposite into a single whole. Synthesis is the end of a turn, which at the same time at the very end is the beginning of the next turn. And this is the destruction of the cycle or phenomenon. It means its transition to a new form of life. That is, transformation is already in a new round. In the life of society, people and the state, it is us and the state, peoples or societies, are also phenomena. The same phenomena as all other natural phenomena. They also have these three stages. The first stage is the scrapping of the old form and the establishment of new principles, the struggle for their approval. Then there is the development of construction based on the approved principles, an attempt to retain them, and at the same time, there is a revision of finding flaws in these principles. And here is this point of opposition. There is a change of movement towards the end of the cycle. And the third cycle is already exhausting these principles that operated in this round. There is preparation, internal preparation for the maturation of future principles of the future round. There is already a struggle for their implementation, and the phenomenon ends, its transformation takes place. This is the end of any phenomenon. So it turned out that the most convenient way to divide any whole is to divide it into 360 fractions, or 360 degrees, or 360 days there, or some other parts, segments. Why? Because all of this number is 360. It is very conveniently divided into all integer simple natural numbers, indivisible, such as 2, 3, 5, 7. Well, nothing is divided into 7 at all, so that's why it turns out to be fractional. Well, even such divisions are used, so to speak. But in fact, as it were, there are only 12 such basic types of division. These are 12 harmonics, which, well, the most basic, the more the arc turns out, that is, the part these, into which the whole is divided, the stronger, accordingly, is the influence of such parts, the greater the part, the greater its significance. And so we get the main, basic, as it were, possible types of division. They are presented in this table. So, the first one is this group. This is a group associated with the division into 2. That is, there is a kind of struggle, opposites of the parties. This is a division by 2, a division by 4, a division by 8, and a fraction of these parts. These are the strong ones. And the smaller the number by which they are divided, the stronger it is, that is, the larger the size of this share, respectively, the strength of this influence increases. And these are the influences they are called strong, or major, tense. Here, and they stand out as if as the main ones. The second most powerful is the method of dividing by 3. The third most powerful is, well, let's say you see there are forces here. Depending on which part we divide into, it turns out that this is the number of the impact force. Accordingly, what are the strongest ones we have? Here is division by 2, division by 4, or rather division by 2, division by 3, then division by 4. Here, and then its division by 5 in strength. And all the other aspects, and even the separation by 6, are also considered strongly in astrology. Why? That is, how would it be highlighted here in bold? These are the largest parts. Further and further, everything that is divided into smaller parts, it, well, let's say, causes less impact on the whole, and therefore is called myonic or weak aspects. This is probably understandable, too. It is necessary to depict these arcs in the form of this drawing. That is, this gray is the whole thing. That's when we divide it into 2 parts. These are 2 red arcs. When we divide by 3, 3 blue arcs appear. Then we can divide these arcs into some parts, that is, we can also divide each of them into our own. It turns out that these small ones, here are the smallest ones, here we have 1/10 of it is 12 fractions of all small ones. If we have 360 parts in total, then the smallest is 12, then we can distinguish an aspect. Not an aspect, an arc of 30 parts in size from 360, here are 36, 45, and so on. Here are all these parts that can be highlighted. In other words, these are very complex, so to speak, and vibrational processes that are very rich in their timbers. Of particular importance for Russia, it so happened that it means, I must say the following, that depending on what composition and what structure of any phenomenon, anything, depending on this, we have different oscillatory processes in it, and we can determine this. For example, well, if we pass by a fence, and let's say we hold a stick on it, we hear one sound. Knock on the table, let's say we hear another sound there. That is, if we are all in sound vibrations, we can listen to any phenomenon, let's say, and understand how it sounds. All this is connected with its internal structure and structure. But there are not only sound vibrations, there are light vibrations, there are electromagnetic vibrations, there are anything. There are wave oscillatory processes, there are generally those that we do not perceive, are not able to perceive with our senses. But nevertheless they all fluctuate, and it can be investigated in some way. So, depending on what kind of phenomenon, each phenomenon has its own timbre, its own special sound. In this sense, we are interested in what kind of special sound does such a phenomenon as Russian civilization or the Russian world have, which we can well find some point at which we believe that this, let's say, arises in Staraya Ladoga. According to the prison Sviridov, the Russian state arose here in 837th year in Staraya Ladoga. And then, based on this beginning of this arc, we see some cycles of its development and rhythms of its development. And it turned out that these rhythms are special for him, and they are connected with the division into 5 for some reason. It just happened. Probably special, well, it's so ordered by nature, let's say. These are the peculiarities of the spirit, the peculiarities of the language, the peculiarities in the worldview of the Russian people, its peculiarities as a cumulative living entity of some kind. These are the further features of this our development. Here it will be possible to read later and stop and understand some details. What do you have these, a set of these creative features, these special, as it were, arcs or aspects that are peculiar to you, oscillatory processes that are peculiar to the Russian world. But first of all, the main one is this firm, which all these aspects are already developing further, smaller ones. This is of course the main one. This is a share of the whole 1/5, which is called from the word. From Latin terms it is called quintal, and if in Russian, it is just 1/5 of the share. If we divide it in half again, it will be 1/10 or a decile. Also understandable decius. Here's half of it. And we can divide this 1/10 into 3 more parts, and get this 1/30th part of the whole. This is a third of a decile, a conditional name. There is also this, if we are 3 of these 3/5, that is, 3/5, that is, every fifth is somewhere 72, that is, it is 72 parts of 360, that is, we multiply it by 3. It turns out 216 years, if we measure it in years. This is the very one, the very fifth, which is expressed in the history of Russia as great historical epochs, and which were studied in the lectures of Sergei Ivanovich in Kievan Rus, fragmented in Russia, and so on. There is also an aspect of doubling this quintil. This is 144 degrees. And there is another aspect associated with these 3. If we take 3/10, not 1/10, which is 36 years, but 3/10, it will be 108 years, or exactly half of 216. This is also a rather active rhythm. Russians consider all these rhythms to be very weak in astrology because they are very strong or insignificant. But it so happened in the history of Russia that these cycles are among the brightest, manifested, and this is connected, as I said, with the special characteristics of the Russian people, the Russian world. Why did this happen? Here Sviridov offers his version that the influence of such weak cycles is small, their role becomes predominant for people or society, with a special destiny, that is, those who hear the voice of the cosmos, performing a certain mission on Earth. In other words, these are so-called special aspects, creative aspects, and they are connected with finding some new ways out, and creating difficult situations. That is, when a special matching generating idea is required. But probably that's why it so happened that Russia is subject to such special, so to speak, unusual cycles. And we can, as it were, compare ourselves with Sherpas who lead climbers through impassable mountain passes of some kind, where there is no oxygen anymore, where you can fall into the abyss. These are like a special kind of people who, as it were, came up with 4 such complex tasks. In this sense, here are the features of Russian statehood in 360 years. You can consider how, on the basis of this graphic, these cycles are in this way within the framework. If we take a total of 360 years, here we see all these cycles, how they are all stacked. If we see this 216-year cycle of this, that these big green arcs are big historical epochs, then we see how these cycles, which I just talked about, work for them, how they fit into it. But the basic ones are the most primary ones that are perceived by a person. This is, of course, what is associated with the period of life that a person lives actively. This is about half. Well, he doesn't understand anything about childhood. In old age, he is already moving away from some kind of activity, from active events. But 36 years of his active life, especially earlier, when people did not live so long, is the cycle that is understandable to a person, which he sees, which he is able to well evaluate, and sees some important differences in it. And if we also perceive this cycle as a separate whole, because each cycle, each of this subcycle is a separate whole, which in turn is also divided into parts and also fluctuates, then there is the same middle in this cycle, that is, it can also be divided into three parts, that is, for a part of the beginning of the ascent, part of the attempt to hold, and yet the collapse down, and the third part is for its completion. Therefore, 36 years, if we divide by 3, we get 12 years each, and here it turns out that this very characteristic coloring of events related to the development of the Russian world. The first 12 years are a statement of the thesis, which, let's say, we can look at 1917, 1929th year, recall, or let's say 1989, 2000 and the first year, and 1953rd, 1965th year. These are 12-year-olds, which means such a transformation, transition to a new social structure. One is connected with the revolution of the 17th year, the other is connected with the Khrushchev thaw, the third is connected with the restructuring that occurred with the arrival, with the destruction of the USSR. These 12-year-olds are the time when new principles of life are being approved. Their rise is underway, these new principles. This does not mean that there is an improvement in life and an increase in well-being, and so on. On the contrary, it may be the destruction of well-being, as the old foundations for being are destroyed, but it is always the growth of new principles, new foundations, their approval, and the scrapping of old ones. That's the essence of this first 12-year-old. These are the plans that were announced, that were maturing inside. They are, as it were, beginning to make their way and break, rebuild, transform public life, state life. This is usually connected with coup. It may be connected with civil wars. It may be connected with some serious such clashes of old and new forces. So, well, the next 12 years is a 12-year period of this retention, or rather a 12-year period of implementation of these established principles already in practice. That is, they begin to reign, they begin to be realized by the material, to be more clearly structured in the material sphere, to be realized, to be approved. This is such a rise, this is the implementation of these principles in life. How they can be implemented. That is, if it was laid down there, that we became part of the Western world as a result of perestroika. And we do not need an economy. So there is a sharp destruction of cities, these enterprises, because they are not needed in this system of a raw colony. They are not needed, and they should be destroyed on new principles. These stations are completely flooded. These nuclear submarines, let's say, have been sawn into pieces, missiles have also been sawn, or sold abroad for pennies. Why? Because these are the new foundations of a new state, a new social structure. And this is exactly the period, this 12-year period, of the most active implementation of all these ideas. And at the same time, there is a revision in people's minds that we are doing something wrong. In the 2007th year of Yukin, Putin is in the middle of this, and this is the 2001-2013 year. Let's say in our recent time, yes, such a period, then suddenly in the middle of this cycle, Putin speaks out and brazenly says that we are against a unipolar world, we are going to build a multipolar world. If he looks at him with his eyes out and thinks that this is a guy, where are you going? Here, and he's like this as an exponent of this. And before that, what did he do? He did everything. So the Americans flooded his submarine, he said yes, it sank. He was told that he did not need the Mir station, he flooded it, he did everything that was ordered. But then, as it were, there is some kind of dissonance in this one, and a point arises, a fracture occurs. And then the preparation for exiting this system begins. But this is still kind of in a hidden form. This is the second 12-year-old. The third 12-year-old is the final destruction of this form, which has existed for 36 years. That is, well, it certainly happens within the framework of larger forms, so not complete destruction, but at the same time, a significant way out of the state that was, that is, a kind of transformation, that is, preparation for a new transformation. This is the correction of those principles that were the first 12-year-olds. Those new ideas about how to develop in the second 12-year-old. And this thesis and antithesis collide, that is, there is a realization in the form of a kind of compilation of these different principles opposing each other, and which we call synthesis. And yet, this synthesis does not yet lead, that is, it is still a form within which an internal contradiction arises, which should lead to a new cycle, to the destruction of this form. And within this form, criticism is being prepared, new, well, principles of the future are being prepared. But they have not yet been manifested in this way. We only usually see this third stage. It is connected with the verification of what has been achieved internally. As the phenomenon itself arises, in this case, we are talking about a public phenomenon, a state phenomenon. There is an increase in criticism of what has been happening all these previous years, and the search for a new one. And on the other hand, there are fierce attacks from external forces that are trying to destroy this form in the form of its shortcomings. Andrew, for a second. So here we have the third period began in the 2013 year, right? Yes, and in 2025 year. Him. And another vivid example. The third period began in 1941, right? Yes, well, now we're just going to look at these. That's it. An attempt to test the strength. There is an attack on the system. Here, all these 12-year-old steps are given very schematically. Here are the first steps of the green one. This is a revolutionary step. Yes, the 81st, 893rd, where it is associated with the rise, the birth of something new. The second is these little blue ones. These are the steps of 12 years, and the steps of trying to hold, and at the same time turning. That is, still rolling down. Antitheses, this is the 929th, 941st, that is. Stalin's construction was going on, but the test was approaching, yes, so to speak, for strength, in the form of the Great Patriotic War, and which ultimately 40 and 65th, 77th year. Maturation is the so-called Brezhnev stagnation, when everyone was dissatisfied. Everything seemed to be wonderful, and the country was growing, and they lived quietly, and a powerful state. But the discontent inside grew. Everyone listened to the enemy's voices, wanted to live like Americans, and so on. And here are 2001, 2013 year. Everything, we built this democratic liberal state, was built into the world Western system. But the people are unhappy, dissatisfied. There is a search for new forms. Andrey, before I forget. Yes, I have the exact opposite assessment of these periods. On the contrary, the 65th, 77th year was full of enthusiasm about. The 29th year, the 41st, these are 5-year plans. This is this walking, so to speak, on the square with flags. 93, 905th, before the revolution. No, that's right, that's right. Sergei Ivanovich, you say everything correctly. Look, really. This, 2001, 2013th year, is an ecstasy. Yes, that's right, you say. In other words, there was no dissatisfaction. On the contrary, there was contentment. No, everything is correct. In general, there is a contentment. These are the years of holding the height. These are the heyday years of the cycle. This is the middle. This is the highest point of the rise of this cycle. But, in general, you're talking about dissatisfaction with this. But because in the middle of this cycle, from the very middle, a worm appears. Andrey, well, it's not so necessary to tell about the worm in passing. This, good. This worm, it arises, that is, this antithesis, it arises. That's not the main thing. Does it always occur? Yes, it arises and begins to gnaw from the inside. And that's why, the 5th, 77th, I remember. Well, as we have Gagarin's flight. After we were the first to go into space, how did you create an atomic one then? It is then that the third 12-year descent is born. It is then that it is born in the middle of this one. No, it is clear that it is being born, but it is clear that it was born here such a small one. Well, a little, because of this little later. Therefore, it leads a little. You have the scale. Ratings. You are biased towards the origin of something opposite. All right. I'm silent. All right. If we recall, why exactly in the 2007 year was the Munich speech? Everything was wonderful. We all did as they asked. On all fronts, we have surrendered all our positions, so to speak. And at the same time, suddenly in the 2007 year, Putin stunned everyone with his Munich speech. Because he, Putin, expressed the opinion of his oligarchs who were surrounded, that it was enough for us to listen, so to speak. To smell, we are independent resources, can develop. And the same thing happened in the middle of the Brezhnev era, when everything seemed great, but we all watched, ran after foreign genes, listened to enemy voices, and at the same time, you do. The accent. On American cars are big, who are always dissatisfied with something. On Japanese electronics there, and so on. Okay, you're focusing on a very small part of the population. No, I say, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, because I am. Okay, fine. Everything. I just corrected your accent a little bit. Good. Well, in general, it's clear how it all happens, the dynamics. So, what else needs to be noted, this is very briefly, is that the cycles overlap each other, these points. And where they overlap each other, then depending on how strong the cycles are and how many points overlap. For example, here we take 216 years. This is where the big cycle is historically shown. And now we see that in the middle of this cycle, we see the point of division by 2, the point of division by 4. The point of separation by 5 is superimposed. That is, 1, 2, 3, that is, it is not so. In short, here we see how many points add up. These are the strongest. Where there is most overlap of these, there is this cycle. This rhythm of influence on the phenomenon is the strongest. Here, Andrey, is another very important point. I'm sorry that I interfere all the time, because I understand that it's better, so to speak, to illustrate. 108 years since 1917 is just that. 2025th year. Guys, this is 2025th year, when a huge number of cycles will go to a turning point, to changes. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 cycles. That is, waiting for us. Direction. This is just a disaster. It will be such a shock for Russia. Yes, and of course these were the important points. Now, if we remember, let's say this is the point that we have 1989th year, right? Here we have 1, 2, 3, 4 overlays going on. 4 overlays. But, of course, in the middle we see 5 overlays. And moreover, the most powerful one, which is not so important to us in essence, but in power, is the division of the cycle into 2 parts. This is a 108-year cycle, so this is the most powerful, the most major impact by 2 fractions. That's why the middle of the cycle is so powerful, it plays such a powerful role. Well, you can also depict this 17-year cycle of heights, like this picture, and see how many such cycles have already passed. The emergence of Kievan Rus before our time here, somewhere up to this point, to the middle of the highest, well, the most recent cycle. This is what we have all lived, let's say, the Russian world. We still have another half of Russia's Udalitsky cycle ahead of us. And we see how this 216-year cycle here, how it is divided into 3 72-year cycles, how they are divided into 36-year cycles, how they in turn are divided into a 12-year cycle. Well, this is like an explanation of the previous slide. And we see that, yes, which is very important. Now, if in a 36-year cycle we saw a division into 12 years, 3 such cycles, which are the ones we described, then, for a large cycle such fractions, the third is a cycle of 72 years. The first cycle, the Soviet cycle, is a cycle of affirmation of new principles of the great historical epoch in which we now live. Our modern existence is the realization of the principles that were put forward in the Soviet era. Strange as it may seem, It may not seem strange, but in essence it is. Why? Because, unfortunately, let's just say, to my regret, the emphasis was shifted in Soviet times. And there was this materialism, the desire to achieve material well-being. It became the prevailing principle of Soviet development. Why did it lead to the destruction of the Soviet era, and why did it lead to the creation of modern Russia? It is in this regard. And therefore, the fact that we are now enriching ourselves, buying cars, building houses, and thinking about it, as if it is the basis for the majority, then this is the implementation of those principles that were laid down in Soviet times. We are organically connected, as if genetically connected with the Soviet era, with those shortcomings, with those, or rather the principles that were, let's say, laid down at that time. And now, in the middle of this development of ours, we realize that we have come out the wrong way. We understand that we have not achieved intangible well-being. We have not achieved sustainable development. We have not achieved confidence in the future. We've lost a lot of things. And now we have to reconsider in some way the picture that was laid down at the beginning, that is, in the Soviet era, which led to our modern Russia. And now we are just coming to this point. In other words, this is now the second cycle, in the middle of the second cycle, and then the third cycle, which will arise in 36 years after 2025th year. This will already be a cycle of implementing those new principles that we will be laying down now in the 25th year. Now let's move on to the illustration, as it were. All of this is based on the example of historical cycles that we can look at, which are more or less familiar to us from history. Well, let's consider the last 36-year cycle of the Russian Empire. This is already the last 72-year cycle. Of this 216-year cycle, that is, the end of it, the third part. And in it, this is the second last 36-year share, which also consists of 3 12-year-olds. The first 12-year-old is, as I characterize it, that this is the spread of social democratic anti-Semitic ideas. Russian nobility, the aristocracy mainly brought to Russia in the idea of Western liberalism and constitutional monarchy. After the foreign campaigns of the Russian army and fought the Decembrists were, right, we'll remember, Freemasonry has come to us. Then this was changed by the people's deputies, who went to the people and tried to raise the peasant to fight against the autocracy. But the peasants handed over these people's deputies to the police because they were not, as it were, enemies of the autocratic system. They just wanted, well, so that there was no land, and there was an opportunity, so to speak. Well, in short, there was a misunderstanding between the people's will and the people. Then, this third is emerging, the third stage, the last 36 years. This is the development of the third stage of revolutionary ideas. It is the emergence of social democratic, socialist ideas as they penetrate into Russia. But if they are the first of this 12-year-old, and we see what is happening here, it means terrorists. There is terrorism. Mass terrorism, the murder of Alexander II. In other words, they are not only killing some generals there, governors there, and so on. And they are already killing, even the emperor has been killed. In other words, this is what this terrorist revolutionary movement has already reached against the autocratic system, against Tsarist absolutism. Then, of course, there is an attempt by Alexander III to preserve it all, to fight this terrorism, but nothing happens. The intelligentsia is on the side, the public is on the side of the terrorists. People don't hand over these terrorists to the Okhrana. It is considered indecent to defend the monarchy. But it is still maturing, as it were, for 12 years it has been maturing inside the country. But it is not expressed in a serious revolutionary situation. Why? Because these terrorist groups, these socialists, these ideological fighters for the monarchy have no strength. There is no possibility of them effectively fighting them, as if the guards are fighting them. After that, the next stage. What's going on? Well, the first thing that is characteristic, it means that Nicholas II comes to the throne, but what happens? The Kodinka catastrophe is happening, which has become, as it were, the knowledge that, well, which always accompanies something in our state, is not in order, since such things. But then there is the monetary reforms of wit, and what happened, in that lets Western capital into Russia as well. And it floods and displaces capital, Russian capital, which was mainly concentrated in Moscow. These are Moscow merchants, Moscow entrepreneurs, Moscow banks. As a result, the Russian merchant class, which has huge material resources, and behind which there are, well, old believer groups, so to speak, becomes on the side of these revolutionary groups. I hope that Russian merchants are creating revolutionary parties of cadets, Octobrists who fought for a constitutional monarchy. This is the very thing. Revolutionary groups are being funded, Freemasonry is developing, we see Bloody Sunday. The first Russian Revolution of 1905 year, prepared by the Russian Moscow merchants, has arisen, is taking place. Tsarism is forced, then, to accept it, well, as it is, to allow the State Duma. In other words, the restriction of the monarchy begins. An attempt to save him is made by Stolipan, the resettlement of peasants to new lands, but it is unsuccessful. And as a result, it also adds to everything, to all these charms, comes the fact that we are entering the First World War. And there is a very difficult situation with the people, the lives of the people, hunger. There is a lack of men who have all gone to the front, and there is already a revolutionary situation that leads to a Jewish revolutions. Then we'll look, so we see the next two 36-year-olds. The first 36-year-old is 1917th, 1953rd year. This is, let's say, the first half, the first third of the last Aquarian Russia. And we see here the first stage is the struggle for the principles of the new government, for Soviet power, the Civil War, the October Revolution. First comes the formation of the USSR. After Lenin's death, a very important event after Lenin's death was the so-called Lenin's call to the party. When the party, which consisted mainly of foreigners, came en masse, which means that factory workers and up to 70% of the party become Russian-speaking in their composition. These are former peasants who have recently become workers. The second 30-year-old, you can read what happened here. This is the construction of the foundations of the Soviet state system. The third 12-year-old is the end of the Stalinist period. It is a struggle with external and internal enemies. USSR. The Great Patriotic War, we managed to protect the country. Then it goes on, the Cold War begins after it. We are building an atomic bomb, but we are fighting cosmopolitans who are beginning to support Western values, the so-called rootless cosmopolitans. The second is a 36-year-old, and there is a murder or death of Stalin. Khrushchev comes to class. Khrushchev at the 20th Congress makes a report on the cult of personality, destroys Stalin's principles, establishes new principles, and the so-called Khrushchev thaw arises. In terms of emotion, there were still many, so to speak, achievements of all sorts of Soviet ones. The first artificial satellite, Gagarin's flight. But eventually Khrushchev is removed, and just before the end of this 12-year-old Brezhnev comes to power. Then we have an attempt to keep the Soviet system, a lack of understanding of how to keep it. We are slipping into Western economic principles. There is a so-called Kosygin reform, which does not give results. There are a number of unpleasant events, such as the death of the Soyuz 11 spacecraft, but at the same time, we see the START treaties in a strange upswing, and at the same time preparations are beginning for the convergence of the USSR's integration into the Western system. The International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis is being created, its branch in Moscow is being summed up, where future foremen of the so-called perestroika are being trained, who then began to rule the country. And the last stages, even the stage of systematic destruction, the collapse of the socialist system and the collapse of the USSR. Despite the fact that there was an attempt to keep it in the form of the Soviet, in the form of the Brezhnev Constitution. The Afghan war comes, there is an Afghan war, Gorbachev comes to power, and his restructuring begins. And then we see these catastrophes that took place: Chernobyl, the collapse of Admiral Nakhimov, the terrible earthquake educator. All this finishes the country. So where is another one? Where else? And here. So, from the 89th to the 2001st year, the country passes to the state of a raw material colony of the world capitalist system. This is mainly done under Yeltsin's leadership. There is a conscious collapse, the execution of the Supreme Soviet. A new constitution is being adopted, the war in Chechnya. And at the very end, in the 2000th year, it means that Putin comes to power. Then the so-called Putin construction begins, construction on new principles, an attempt to integrate Russia into the Western system as a partner, and at the same time defend national interests, some of its own national interests, primarily of the elites. On the one hand, we are doing everything right, flooding the stations, and everything that can be said to be destroyed. And at the same time, we see Putin's Bayankinskaya speech being led by a Chechen company, that is, an attempt to preserve the integrity of the country. BRICS is emerging, APEC, the customs union is emerging. In other words, Russia is beginning to try to defend itself, its interests. And then the last stage of the 2013 year is the stage in which we are still in now. This is already an attempt to protect Russia's interests from Western globalism. At first, it was stated diplomatically. Then it was confirmed specifically by a military operation. And here are the ideas that were voiced in the Munich speech in 2007 year, the ideas of a multipolar world. A struggle begins for them, already armed and political. The presidential decree on traditional values is being adopted. This happens in our country in 2022 year. In the 2023 year, the concept of foreign policy is very important, where Russia is already called the state of civilization. It is argued that Russia has its own special traditional cultural values, which it will defend by any means. So we are moving towards a turning point, a revision of our situation, but what will it be like next? Here we go back to this 2025 year again. What will it mean for us? So far, this can only be predicted. And so, let's just say, well, the forecast is based on the previous cycles that we see. So the yellow ones are the previous historical cycles. We see here that everything of the first cycle is the coming to power of Princess Olga, who baptized herself and her immediate environment to begin with, and most importantly, she established a system of taking Denmark, that is, she changed the principles of the state structure, led the system of lessons and churchyards. That is, if it was chaotic before, now it has legalized some rules for the management of Kievan Rus. Then we see that, similarly, 2025 year in Russia is fragmented. This is 1161st year. This is a change in the principles of governance of the country. If it was earlier by seniority, the Grand Princely power in Kiev was replaced. Then, in 1161st year, the prince's allies, the allies of Andrey Bogolyubsky, burned Kiev and established, and at the same time, Kiev ceased to be the capital of the Russian world. And Bogorodsky moves the pages to another city, changed the principle, therefore, of princely governance of the country. It was a radical turnaround at that moment. Then we see in Rusordiensk, it exactly coincides with the victory on the Rains River and the Battle of Kulikovo. It was also a struggle between two different principles, the old Horde influence or the new Muscovite Russia, which wanted to replace, that is, the disintegrating environment and rule itself on its territory. Despite the fact that we have been paying for more than 100 years, up to 1,000, we can say for 185th year, for more than 100 years, but we were not under the Horde, as it were. The following year he came to Moscow and burned it. Nevertheless, it means that this was the turning point that led to the end of the Horde Russia in 1485th year. That is, this middle point, it leads to the fact that the cycle, where 2016 years ends, and a new one begins. This is all born in her. Then we look. The Moscow state is also a key point. This is the beginning of the time of troubles, when there is a change of dynasties, a change in the principles of government, and so on. This is the most important period of the Moscow state in terms of perestroika. A new dynasty of novels with basic principles is coming. In the Russian Empire, 1809th year is the infection of liberalism, revolutionary ideas in foreign campaigns. This is where this began, the source of the collapse of autocracy and serfdom, autocratic absolutism, which led to the revolution. The February Revolution, then to the October Revolution. And we are approaching 2025th year. Well, in my opinion, it will be a kind of revision of the principles of building the Russian world. I hope that this will be based on the principles of some kind of conciliar unity, a new principle of understanding the purpose of our development in general. And in a brief form, how would I try to express it here in this text, which can be read according to the principle laid down in the 2017 year, when we first began to build a state of workers, a state, so to speak, wherefore the development of the whole people without exploiting people and so on. Then, presumably, these principles are bright the principles that were laid down in the 17th year. They should be restored to a new level of understanding.
Вот эти принципы, светлые принципы, которые были заложены в 17 году, они должны быть как бы восстановлены на новом уровне понимания.
And then, as it were, we should offer these principles to me and a hand. As a matter of fact, we are already seeing their rudiments of development in the struggle that Russia is waging, in a special military operation against the Western world. And we are already seeing support from other countries, first of all the BRICS countries, that is, we already have a huge number of supporters. Most likely, this new world is some kind of multipolar, that is, it is such a not-so-good term multipolar, that the world cannot be multipolar. But it means some kind of organic, living world, where every part is important, every part is part of a living whole. So we somehow have to offer the world a new civilization and become, perhaps, one of the centers of this civilization. That's how I see it. And I'm probably going to finish my report on this or something. So I'm waiting for questions, criticism. So, colleagues, so you say, now there will be questions. Let's quickly keep up the pace, because we have so much time, so to speak. It took the report that. Well, I think that 10% just listened to the end, so let's keep up the pace. And good. Thank you for the report. 2 questions in the margins that I marked myself. Are there similar astrological cycles in relation to other peoples? If in theory this model describes reality, yes. Then probably yes, there should be more examples. Or is it such a unique thing with respect to the Russian people? No, every nation, of course, develops on the basis of its rhythms. The combination of rhythm, as I have already said, that each phenomenon has its own rhythms. Here, but there is, in order to investigate these developments, it is necessary to know the history of, let's say, this people well. Very serious. That is, let's say I know that such studies have been conducted in France, but I'm not an expert, so I can't, so to speak, tell you what happens there on the basis of some cycles. Well, of course, it's all possible for other peoples to explore everything, but it will probably have a different characteristic. Some other assessments. Next question, Stanislav. I have, yes, one more question. This model implies some kind of correction for the intensification of the processes that we are currently observing. It is obvious that the world has changed a lot over the past centuries. Humanity has changed. And of course, the influence that these cycles had on some primitive societies before, it was completely different than it is now. Yes, that is, when we have everything rapidly, yes, as if it is accelerating. Well, yes, so I think not. That there are some general laws of system development, some common rhythms. They are, well, mathematically prescribed. It's impossible to change them. The acceleration of some kind of material, intellectual life, does not change from this cycle. Great. I'm going to make an amendment now. This is the first question I asked, by the way, to Andrey. And here is the second question that everyone asks absolutely. Because it seems to everyone that we live in some special time when the speed of social processes has changed incredibly, and no old models work. 90% of people are sure that there is no point in considering old models at all. They must be discarded, forgotten. We live in a special time in which only we live. Guys, so astrology is the rotation of the planets. The rotation of the planets has not accelerated, has not changed over the last decades, centuries, millennia there. It is what it is, it was, it is. Another thing is that the fullness of events, the density of events within the same cycles, has increased greatly. So the fullness and density have increased, but the cycles have remained as they were. The same person. If earlier, let's say, a peasant was born there, was born in a peasant family, and died in a peasant family, and his events could be listed on the fingers. He was born there, so to speak, grew up, got married, plowed the field, plowed, grew old and died, right. Now there are so many events happening during life, but still from birth to death, there is still some period of constant saturation changes. But this rhythm, Igor, remains unchanged from my point of view, from Andrey's point of view. So, a question. No, I have a small one. Correction. Comment on yours. Your comment. So astrology is not guided by the movement of the planets. The movement of the planets is guided by astrology. And we, based on these movements, just as an illustration, look at how it can be with us. In other words, let's just say that we are a planet for us. It's like a demonstration of what is happening inside us. Because in the law of the whole rhythmic impact, they have the same effect on both planets and people. Correction. Stanislav. Question. I have a question about the prequintal, for 216 years. At the beginning of the report, he fell on the 2025th year. No, 2025th year. Queen is 216 years old. This is a great historical epic. It begins with us in the 17th year and ends in 2133rd. And 2025th is the middle of this three-quintal. And we can also call it beautifully called quint. A fifth is a harmonious three-fifths of the whole. Now, if we take the whole, divide it by 5, and from this 5, we combine 3 parts into a pile, this will be a clint. Here's a Polish clint movie. Therefore, surprisingly, it is precisely the harmonious clint that has become the size of a large historical cycle of the Russian world. So here's some interesting, beautiful connection. Stanislav, another question. Another question, but purely such a formal battle on the Voza River on the chart, was in 1377th year. It is generally accepted that in 1378th year, but it probably does not matter. No, I am in this case, so it must be understood that for each aspect, the larger this aspect, well, that is, the larger the arc in size, the greater the radius, so-called. Variance. Yes, let's call it variance. Astrology is called differently. Well, it doesn't matter, that's it. Scatter. The scatter, within the framework of which it means that we still influence, and people influence, and the will affects individuals and collectives, and so on some phenomena. And so something happens a year earlier, a year later, and so on. Well, this is approximate. Well, I get it, it matters. Well, look, yes, I think that the questions are over, although there will not be a word there. I just wanted to say that a panorama of a completely different approach to historical events has now been laid out in front of us. A fundamentally different approach to historical events. You understand, right? That is, if before this approach, the whole history consists of some random events that should be systematized, unrelated, chaotically presented in history textbooks, namely, let's say the revolution of 1905th year, or let's say the death of some Stolipan there, they stand in a row, that is, they are not ranked by importance, by significance. There is no hierarchy of events. This is just a list of historical facts. That's the whole modern history, by and large, this is a list of historical facts. Moreover, in this mess of historical facts, there are only now alternative versions of explanations. Up to denying all this mess at all. That is, there are people who say, yes, there was no history at all. It all started there 20 years ago, or 30, or 100 years ago. And some say, no, it's aliens who arrived there 300 million years ago, and then they went wild. In other words, this kind of nonsense is now going on a historical platform. Why? Because there is no science there. Because there is no law there. There are a lot of facts, and a complete arbitrariness of people who invent what I want. The little one made up one story, this one made up another story. Do you know how many alternative stories there are now? At least 10. Moreover, each supporter of his version categorically denies all other versions. Well, that's it, that's the only correct one of mine. Another says, no, the only correct one is mine. Why? Yes, because there is a historical factor in this mess. You see, one pulls out one set, the other pulls out another set, but it's like, so imagine putting more on everyone's table. Everyone has borscht. Someone pulled out the cabbage, says, borscht. This is cabbage soup. Someone pulled out a beetroot and said, no, you're wrong, borscht. This is beetroot soup. And the third one says, no, borscht is potato soup. That is, which of them is right? Yes, they are all right and all wrong. Why? Because history is not really a random set of facts. We have tried many times to explain to our audience that history is a natural process. In this natural process, there are global, very large logical events that are divided into local, that is. There is a fractal picture, and this is important, a fractal picture is a harmonious picture. Here Andrey demonstrated it. Why? Because all these divisions into 2, 3, 5 are nothing but the well-known Pythagorean division of the octave into parts. Everyone knows that there is a fifth there, an octave there, and so on and so on and so on. Yes, I apologize. I said Archimedes, but I should have said Pythagoras. Pythagoras. I was wrong. Well, maybe I was wrong, but no. I think Archim also understood this. I think I can get away with it. And Vago, of course, led to harmony. So that's really what it says, that we are only on the threshold of creating a new theoretical history. Do you understand? Theoretical history is a history that will be based on strictly mathematical, harmonic, musical patterns of these patterns. In the division of the period and on logic, the system logic of explaining what is happening. Here's what Andrey did at the base, so to speak. I do not know Pavel Sviridov, there are not Pavel Sviridov, so to speak. What he was talking about, and what I have been doing for the last 8 reports, I tried to use these numbers, I highlighted, note, 12, 36, 72, 108, 216, 144, 360. I first plunged into this mess for the first time when I met, then pulled out a 216-year cycle from there. I liked it with something, right? Then I realized that I liked it. Here is a 216-year cycle that describes the resource history in Russia very clearly and clearly. Because there is a clear transition. Before that, let's say bread was grown there. Then furs began to be created, so to speak, to the west. The furs ran out, they started to switch to hemp or Peter the Great. In other words, I pulled out this one period, and on the basis of this one period, I tried to build, so to speak, the history of our whole long-suffering and multi-creative country. Why am I saying this? Because seriously speaking, no one is able to cope with this task alone. But the collectives that will work as a whole institute, let's assume a systemically rhythmic, harmonious history there. But create one in which each cycle will be studied. Moreover, there is also the influence of not only internal cycles in the history of Russia. We live on an uninhabited planet. You see, this is the principle, so to speak, of this boy, where he lived there with Rose alone. And we live surrounded by other civilizations, which have their own rhythms, their own cycles, which affect us very much. Beat our rhythms, cycles. In other words, it's like if we breathe there, we have a breath, let's say one breath in 2 seconds. Suddenly out of the blue in the ring, so to speak, someone gave us a Western boxer, so to speak, in the solar plexus. And we stopped breathing. And then, so to speak, they came to their senses, began to breathe faster. That is, well, how can we talk about some kind of breathing somewhere there with a period like this, or there's a heartbeat and everything else? There are a lot of civilizations around us that live in a different rhythm, and this rhythm also affects. And so if we want to say now that Andrey has come, and we will explain everything to us. Nothing like that. Andrey came and showed us the way to this complex explanation, so to speak, in fact, and where this complex explanation of ours should go, in which direction. And this 12-year-old is the most valuable thing for me at the moment. Why? Because this is what began in 1989 year, when this perestroika began, when they began to lay another foundation. Then it all became established after the Putin period of 2013 year. Right now it's a 36-year-old, it ends with us being tested for strength, as in the Great Patriotic War, the Stalin era. We are tested for strength until the 25th year. After the 25th year, a completely new cycle begins, and it begins not only in the 12-year calculus, but also in the 36th year. And remember, Andrey spoke there, 108 years old, and others. In other words, we are standing with you on the threshold. There will be such changes in a year and a half that will make your head spin. If we don't build at least some kind of logical scheme now in these 1.5 years, then we will simply get lost in this new world. Therefore, we urgently need to imagine what will happen after the 25th year on the basis of all these theories. Well, the last thing I wanted to say is that Andrey constantly says that for Russia, he really repeats Pavel Sviridov. This is a 72-year cycle, this is a 5-year separation. This is a creative rhythm, a 5-fold separation. I can just give another example here. There is such a science of crystallography, right? In crystallography, it has always been believed up to a certain time, up to 2001 years, that there are axes of symmetry of the first order, second order, third order, fourth order, and sixth order. Fifth order axes were strictly forbidden in crystallography. There were none, because fifth order axes are what? These are pentagons. And pentagons are on the surface of what shapes? Yes, difframes. And nobody has observed pentagons and DD frames in crystallography. And where are the ways of the fifth order manifested in the first place? In the wild. That is, if we see the fifth axis of order, the axis of the fifth order of symmetry, then we see signs of wildlife. Therefore, if this division by 5 is characteristic of Russia, this is axial symmetry, then what does this mean? About the fact that we are closest to living nature, and if some other civilization suddenly turns out that there is a property of dividing by 3 or 4 there and so on, periodicity, yes, then it does not mean that it is necessary to abandon inanimate nature and soar in some such incomprehensible, so to speak, in Solaris. No, we need to understand that living nature is a part of inanimate nature with this nature. To understand the difference between living nature and inanimate nature, that is, it's just that. But it's very good that we actually have autumn of the fifth order and division by 5, and this is the brightest cycle for us. Here, but I'm done. I think we have exceeded all our time limits, but if there are any other questions, let's quickly go through them. No questions? No, well, thank you all for your attention there. Just a second, Sergei Ivanovich. Your very, very valuable last remark about the axes of the fifth order, which is really a special liveliness of the structure. And so, I want to emphasize once again for those who have listened to the end that the unique structure of the Russian language, which there are only as many as 0.3% of the languages of this type of language in the world, which has such a living structure as the Russian language. And a special way of thinking, the so-called mind of a living whole based on construction, that is, embedding. Always searching for agreement based on such a language is also characteristic of the Russian world. Therefore, we have, let's say, well, poorly understand those peoples and civilizations that are based on other axes in order. Well, thank you. Yes, I think this is the right addition. Look, I want to thank on behalf of all of our present, I think now the audience of Andrey, for such a complex prepared report. You can't even imagine how much work it took to tell us all this in a condensed form. Moreover, I think that this is 1/10 of the work that Andrey did and demonstrated to us here. In fact, there is a much wider scope of work that he has done, but again, our perception is so arranged that we cannot perceive the new as a whole at once. We need to give it in pieces. That's why this piece that Andrey gave us, I think we will develop it, and moreover, we will try to use the same approach in our next lecture meeting, which will be dedicated to Russia Vodolina since 1917th year. Why? Because if earlier, I will come back to this idea again. What if earlier I looked very superficially at the internal structure of the 216-year cycle, trying not to pay attention to it at all? That is, let's say we fly there by plane, we see a forest. We say, we see the forest. And the fact that in the forest, there is some kind of pine forest, there is some kind of birch grove, and so on. We did not pay attention to it. So, when we begin to analyze the era of the Soviet Union since 1917th year, this time will not come down to us, because nothing will be clear if we do not descend from this global approach, literally, to 12-year cycles. That's why it's so difficult for me to approach this period now. Therefore, I will prepare for the next report, based on the report of Andrey Kinsbursky. Thank you to him, thank you to everyone present. If there are any questions left, please ask them. If you haven't, then let's turn off the recording, and then talk about something else. My image of the future of the beautiful Russia, which I will present as part of the general cycle of the metaphysics of the history of Russia. But I warn in advance those who have already seen the previous videos. There will be some repetitions here. It's okay, you can skip them. Why? Because for those people who come here for the first time, it will actually be some so poor in order to understand everything else. So, a wonderful image of the future of Russia. Let's start with the fact that for 10 lectures, we have considered these resource stages of the Russian economy, the export economy of Russia in the past. We remember that we looked at 6 stages, and at each stage, there was some kind of dominant product. Here they are reflected. All these stages were invented by Pavel Sviridov. We just took these stages and remembered them with some kind of economic content. Here, but the main conclusion that we came to last time is that here is a new Russia. In the one that we live in since 1917th year, Russia, unfortunately, has again entered the raw materials, so to speak, export economy. Why? Because if you look at the post-revolutionary years, our country tried to export grain. and grain was the main export product in the 30s. But then the harvest did not come, the population grew. Famine and other things began. After the war, our country exported industrial products to third world countries for a long time, and this was our main export commodity. Since the 70s, as you can see, we have again gone to natural resources. It was a short period of industrial production. And so, in general, the whole history of Russia is the exploitation of natural resources in order to receive export revenue and maintain the state and the army. In this case, we went back to hydrocarbons in the 70s. Hydrocarbons, as you remember, they occupy more than 80%. Well, all the resources of natural deposits occupy more than 80% of our export pie. That's our, so to speak. Unfortunately, history has returned again to this very natural resource, so to speak, economy. But we have assumed that after this sixth cycle, there will be a seventh cycle in which the creative potential of the Russian people will become the main resource. Here it is depicted that the next stage of the seventh, which will begin in 2133rd year, is according to the calculations of Pavel Sviridov. I completely agree with him. This will be the stage when the creative potential of the Russian people will become the main resource, which for the first time will make our qualities of our people the main value in our country, including for the authorities and for the rest of the world. If we recall, so to speak, the 70s, 60s, and 70s of the last century, then there is nothing so stunning in this forecast of mine, because for a long time, well, 20 years at least, we were leaders in scientific and technological progress, embodied, so to speak, in spacecraft, ships of research centers, and so on, including weapons, which now gives us the opportunity to resist the attacks of the West. Here. But if we recall the entire, so to speak, resource history, then hunting, gathering, cattle breeding, agriculture, then again a return to hunting in the Moscow Kingdom, then Peter's times of the manufactory of industrial agriculture. And here is our, so to speak, the last sixth stage. We jumped out into the industry and space exploration. These are all the steps of one big path. What I want to say is that the global external prerequisites for Russia's innovative future are as follows. There is such a famous forecast by Toffler that humanity has passed through 3 stages of appropriation of agriculture: agrarian traditional society, industrial society, and is now painfully entering the 4th stage of the information society. To be honest, I do not fully agree with Stockner in the forecast for the future, so here I have my own scheme. Going after his hunting really is appropriating farming, cattle farming, where there is nothing to argue about. Industry, yes, indeed. But we will have a future, not an information future, not an information future. Here are ethereal energy and ethereal technologies firms, ethereal informatics. I have told you many times what ethereal energy, ethereal informatics is. This is a grandiose transformation of the whole world, with access finally to the primordial universal information deposits and primordial universal unearthly energy deposits. We will have to do this in the next century. This is a grandiose task, and we cannot do it without creative, so to speak, and we cannot do it without creative teachings. Moreover, as you remember, I have models of the relay race of civilizations. According to this model, Europe has completely exhausted its creative potential by the 2000th year. That is, it has moved from the 3rd creative stage to the 4th imperial one, and Russia is just starting from the 2nd training stage now. Well, these stages are depicted here in general terms. That is, any civilization goes through 4 stages. The first one is childhood, its preparation. Further training is childhood, that is, it is youth, training, apprenticeship. Now we have passed this period. And the next stage of 500 years, this is for any civilization, is the creation of its own worldview, a new paradigm, and new amounts of technology. We are just now entering this period, and Europe is emerging from it, falling into the 4th, so to speak, imperial period. In other words, from the point of view of the relay race of civilization, we are on the transition from the 2nd to the 3rd stage. This withdrawal is very serious. Why? Because the development of the world heritage of apprenticeship has ended before us. We have nothing more to learn from humanity, from absolutely no one. In other words, any knowledge of the past, any teachings, any wisdom of the past is no longer interesting for us. We need to create our own knowledge, our own ideas, our own worldview, fundamentally new ones. And this is a very serious, so to speak, transition from apprenticeship to creativity, rather than global creativity. This is according to the relay race. Again, it's just expanded the opera a little bit. Humanity has passed the development of this sphere, the agricultural sphere, the technosphere, and is entering the development of the cosmosphere. Each of these stages was somehow mastered by certain civilizations, this sphere. These agricultural spheres were mastered by other civilizations. The technosphere was mastered by the West. But the cosmosphere can be mastered, from my point of view, only our civilization, the Russian one. And that is why Russia is a civilization of the planetary and cosmic future. Now about the specifics already. What do we have? We have the 20th century, which has shown our creative potential. We have proved to the whole world and to ourselves that we can create great examples of new technologies, new products, and so on. So on, so on, so on. It would seem that all this is in the past, but nothing like that. Recently, research has shown that we have the highest creative potential in Russia. Every 10th Russian is an innovation, 10%. Britain is 6, Finland is 5, the USA is also 5, Japan is 3. I think it's close to 0 in the Arab world. In other words, Russia is the leader in terms of potential, creative potential in the world. It is necessary to learn how to use this potential competently. That's why we have a project with you. Those who know about this project is an innovative development platform. This is a worldwide project. It involves the creation of some kind of ecosystem within which every person, no matter where he is, will somehow engage in creativity according to a certain algorithm within a certain computer platform. In other words, a person logs into the system, registers, and then, so to speak, his system itself tells him with whom he needs to interact in this case in order to move to the next step. Well, any innovation goes through the stage of an idea, so to speak, an experimental sample to the market, where it all turns into mass production. This intermediate stage before entering mass production works best. I know this for sure firsthand. I see it in my partners. I see it in my Russian activity too. In other words, we can easily give birth to a new idea. We can easily bring it to an experimental sample. We can easily bring it to experimental production. But then we need to enter the world industrial market. We need external, so to speak, partners. But one way or another, I believe that this feast scheme should eventually become the basis for the export economy of the whole country. In other words, it is necessary to turn this scheme into the main economic basis for the whole country. In other words, the feast is the patrons of innovative development, and the whole country turns into such a thing as Naudoct. And experimental workshops, production, and all this is being done for the whole world. So, the Ministry of Innovative Development. I've specially picked up her gravutures here. This is the world. The world is the world. That is, our Ministry of Innovative Development serves. And the world of innovative development serves as a peer platform for innovative development. So, peace to the world, a feast to the world. And the ultimate goal, so to speak, for our country is to create an economy in which our country, it will solve problems through innovative developments that any country in the other world, including our country, faces. By the way, our economy is traditional, and we must make our country such a circulatory system for the whole world, when the oxygen of fresh ideas to develop from Russia will solve pressing problems around the world. Naturally, if we turn our country into a Naudoct, which will ensure the resolution of problems for the whole world, including, so to speak, the West and the East, and the South and other directions, then no one, of course, will conquer us, because we will be such a vital organ for the whole world. And moreover, the whole world will protect us. In other words, in this particular case, if we speak with all Merkelev's comrades, we really need to win now, first, so to speak, the Western invasion of wars, and then, so to speak, to win the war. In other words, in principle, when we become a single harmonious humanity, the war will be in the past. Why? Because in a single organism, as you understand, we have no war between the heart, let's say, the lungs, the stomach there, the intestines and other organs. If there was, we wouldn't have lived a minute with you. We have a harmonious, holistic interaction of our systems. This is the only model that will be created all over the world sooner or later. It will win the war. Why? Because this is a unity, in which war will be absent by definition, because any military action will destroy this single organism, and it will perish. If this organism has an instinct of self-preservation, it will have such an instinct of self-preservation. Then it will not unleash any wars within itself. It's obvious. Therefore, the only way to defeat the war as a whole is to create a unified, harmonious humanity. As for our economy, let's go down from world problems to domestic problems. Currently, our economy is a very ugly formation in which raw materials are almost, well, up to the dominant. 80% of our export products are raw materials. I want to say again, for those who do not understand what an export economy is, we are communicating with you now with the help of export gadgets, with the help of the Internet export system. We drive export cars, import cars more precisely, that is, imported cars. So we are immersed in this world division of labor, and we will never come back from it. This Stalinist self-sufficient economy will never come back. If we want to do this, we will perish. This is the way to nowhere, the way is dying. But in addition to the raw materials economy, we have innovation under a big question. I declare it directly responsibly, because I have been engaged in innovation all my life. We practically have this independent activity, which is very poorly supported by the state. High-tech production of unique products, well, we have spacecraft, but as you remember, it was not possible to land on the moon. That is, we have it all now in such a state of semi-life. Well, we currently do not have a space industry as such. And what Alexei dreams of is this robotization and coverage of the Dyson sphere. This has yet to be created. I assume that if we create an innovative sector of the economy, it will fuel the knowledge-intensive production of unique products with its ideas, and all this together, all three grounds, will give us the opportunity to enter the space industry and create a truly cyber civilization of the future there. Here, and now for Genesis. Here is our economy. Here is the image of this on the left on a black background. This is today. This basic dominance is raw materials, unique objects, but some things are being done, but not to the extent that we need. There is industrial agriculture, but it is not fully developed yet. But there are practically no eco-settlements. Why? Because their villages have been destroyed. People have accumulated in the cities. What Oleg talked about, we have yet to create. In the future, our export economy, so to speak, will become, and our whole way of life, it will be in the form of such a lively, beautiful pyramidal Christmas tree, which will be based on really eco-settlements. Why? Because innovative processes, they require, so to speak, privacy, communication with nature. Agriculture will be more developed, much more developed. There will really be these robot harvesters walking around. Yes, we have conditions under which it is possible to extract much more grain. And in addition to growing with robots, so to speak, here are algae. But anything can be grown with robots. And industrial agriculture will, of course, be our, so to speak, support. The raw materials economy, well, where can we get away from it? Of course, it will develop, it will be improved, including hydrogen, so to speak, and oxygen fuel, and other delights in the development of this. And here are the unique objects. But we are going to make unique objects now, but I would say, due to the inertia of the past years, the Soviet period mainly. But I know the prerequisites for creating a completely new industry that would not produce galoshes, as Comrade Putin explained to us, but that this unique, so to speak, industry, it would produce completely unique not only nuclear mills, spacecraft, but also unique technological complexes. There are prerequisites for this, and such unique technological complexes are already being created. If you visit the channel on the Innovative Development platform, you will see the reality of this new industrial breakthrough. Here, well, at the very top of this Christmas tree, there will be innovation. Here are creative people, of whom we have a lot, living in eco-settlements, using the farm, providing the opportunity to produce unique objects, will live in such eco-settlements that Oleg assumed, told us. I totally agree with him. Yes, indeed, it is a center that unites, so to speak, all innovative and technical, so to speak, industrial areas. Including there, and around it there is such an agricultural zone in which innovative agricultural processes will develop. And these innovation centers will provide food. Within the framework of such innovative eco-settlements, I am 100% sure that it is impossible to build some kind of metallurgical plant in the center here, or dig out some kind of diamond pipe there, so to speak, or, so to speak, build some kind of tank factory here inside such an eco-settlement. In other words, we must understand that this settlement is 100,000, there are more or 10,000, or there are 20,000, it does not matter. It is assumed that they will be, first of all, an abode for our innovators, for the authors of ideas, for the developers of ideas, for the technical executors of these ideas, for experimental workshops, for the experience of small-scale industrial productions. Here, what kind of social system, I think, within the framework of an innovative economy, there can only be a communist system. What is it? He refused according to his abilities, let's remember, to everyone according to the needs of the average level of society. This idea, which has been discredited by the last periods of the US development, actually has no alternative. I'll explain why. The fact is that for the innovation industry, for the innovation process, the only way of central organization results is this communist one. This is how scientific incubators are arranged in Israel, and scientists are happy in them. They don't care about anything and think only about research, discoveries, and inventions. Thus, the Israeli authorities have created centers for scientists and inventors exported from the USSR. I myself communicated with such a scientist myself while vacationing in Israel by the sea. He, you know, is like a perfectly happy seal lying on the shore. Why? Because he is an authority in his environment. He does what he loves, and for any inventor and research scientist, the most important thing that he does not talk there is to be able to conduct his research indefinitely. He will always find something there, search, invent, and so on, so that he doesn't think about these. These are the people who organize such work of these scientists who use this, so to speak, the fruits of their inventions. They have created ideal conditions. The ideal conditions are that he has an average apartment. Well, let's say there is a 4 or 5 room apartment in Israel. He has a full social network, that is, it is free medical care. Twice a year, he leaves for free completely at the expense of the company that created this center to rest. Every 3 years a car changes, but not a Rolls-Royce, of course, but the average is such a good solid car. Children go to his school for free, go to universities for free. The same thing is provided for them. For the whole family, not only for him, a social program in medicine is provided. That is, they don't think about what will happen if he gets sick. They don't think about what will happen if, let's say, there is some kind of crisis there tomorrow. They have everything set up. The pit is adjusted. Just create. Why? Because, creator, I am exhausted. These are not workers at the machine. A working machine can make 10 parts. It can make 100 parts. There is a person from the production. He does not need to be adjusted. He does not need to be forced. He does not need to put any external incentives. Well, except for such things as fame, publications, speeches, and so on. But it's cheap to do everything, right? Just give him the opportunity to sing his creative song here, and he will sing it until the end of time. As Pavlov, who is dying, even investigated his dying process, so to speak, from the point of view of physiology. A creative person doesn't need anything else. If we have such 10% in Russia, it is natural that they will live in this communism.
будут жить в этом коммунизме.
But again, every scientist here who creates by himself needs another 50 assistants.
Сам по себе нуждается еще в 50 помощниках.
And that's where the arithmetic begins. Look if we have 10%. This is such a future, I'll tell you later. If we have 10% of creative people, that's 14 million. According to the norms, world norms, not approved by me, this is the American norm. For each inventor, 50 assistants are needed to help him bring his invention to mind. These are developers, designers, technicians, managers, critics, supporting staff, and so on, so on. 50 people to one, and there are 14 million of us, let's say. We assume that we have used all the creative potential of our country, and all 14 million of our creative people who are able to create. They are involved in this innovative economy, and that's what they are, like 50 people to each. If we multiply 14 million by 50, we get 700 million assistants. In other words, you can imagine how many people there really are not enough in Russia to create this Russia of a wonderful future. In other words, our women still have a lot of work to do to replenish, so to speak, our population. Here, but this is, of course, a light kind of humor. Here, but if not even 10 or 14 million will be involved, and, let's say, there will even be 1 million involved. Yes, in the creative process, then this is 50 million assistants. Well, it's still a huge army, a huge economy. Keep in mind that 500,000 people are currently employed in the field of resource extraction. Only 500,000 people, 500,000. There are 2 million people in the service of a personal official somewhere there. Transport is still there. And here, 1 million inventors out of 14 million, 7% will only be selected. They have 50 assistants who will help them. They, of course, will also live under communism, because the inventor cannot enjoy all the benefits there, and around him there will be working assistants, engineers and designers who will live under the old regime. Yes, that is, accordingly, it will be 50 million people who will live in this beautiful communist system. Here, this is the kind of creative future that awaits Russia. Before we return to Earth, here we are going to talk about why and how it really is. Does such a model of the future have any analogies? Yes, it does. Look, our body, here it consists of 12 subsystems. One of these systems is the central nervous system with the brain. So, our brain, it makes up only 2% of our body's response. I see, right? We conduct a monologue. 140 million Russians are 2% of the total population. Does it match? It seems to match, about the same proportion. Next, our brain, it does not live according to the laws of our body. Our brain is separated from our body by a hematoencephalic barrier. What does this mean? This means that all the biochemistry that takes place inside the body, it is delayed by this barrier, and inside the brain, there is its own biochemistry, its own processes exclusively designed for the brain. What does this mean? That within this innovative country of the future, Russia will have its own economic and social laws, and there will be a hematoencephalogical barrier. If you want to get into the world of creativity, you show your creative potential, and well, you are accepted here. Here you live by special laws. All that is required of you is to create endlessly for the benefit of all mankind. And that's it. Everything else will be provided to you by the service personnel who will know how to serve this brain, the creative brain of humanity. Here. That's my ideal model of the future, yes. Well, what do we have now? We now have the scenario that Comrade Merkelov spoke about. In fact, we are currently fighting with the West. Right now, the main one is a warrior, because Western centrism does not want to give up its Western centrist positions. It wants to dominate this world. Here, But here is the scheme of Comrade Malgo Sergei Yuryevich, professor at Moscow State University, head of the Strategic Research Department, which shows what awaits us in the next century. First, there will be a struggle with Western centrism. Then there will be global chaos, which can take place against the background of all kinds of shocks, including economic catastrophes and the Third or Fourth World War. After all this chaos, assembly will begin. Assembly will begin from the destroyed world of 5 or 7 blocks of some kind. The West, China, India, the Russian world, the Arab world, Latin America, Africa, perhaps. This is a civilizational assembly. This is the stage that Comrade Mal calls globalization. In other words, instead of 200 countries, the political arena will be represented by some 7 large blocks. When they finally self-determine and their borders and role in the future of humanity are determined, global harmonization will begin. That is, there will be a reassembly of humanity, but not on the basis of their 200 states, which now cannot agree on anything at all, but on the basis of these 7 blocks. But I think it will be easier for 7 managers to negotiate with than 200. This is the beginning of harmonization, which will begin at the end of this century. This is the scheme of Sergeyevich Malkov, a professor at Moscow State University. I completely agree with her. I can't add anything to this. Well, this is how I see, so to speak. This is a wonderful future. This image was created by Andrey Vladimirovich Kinsbursky. Here we are right here at the apex of our cycle. Here we are, this collective little man with a briefcase and a telescope, who is trying to discern our wonderful, innovative future. Through 200 years there, the phoenix bird is what awaits us. Thank you for your attention. I finished the presentation. Now questions and